When she picked the lock to his heart at midnight, neither of them knew it would change everything forever. Jake had always been the kind of guy who liked things just so. His small apartment near the college was his safe space. Everything had its place. Books lined up perfectly on shelves. His coffee mug always sat in the same spot on his wooden desk, and his bedroom door stayed locked every single night. At 24, he was working on his master's degree in English while pulling shifts at the campus bookstore to pay the bills. His life was simple and predictable, just the way he preferred it. Wake up at 7, coffee and toast, classes until 3, work until 8, then home to study and read until he fell asleep. It wasn't exciting, but it was peaceful. The apartment building Jake called home was one of those old brick places with creaky floors and pipes that made strange noises at night. The walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbors' TV shows and phone calls, but the rent was cheap enough for a broke graduate student. He'd been living there for almost a year and had gotten used to the quirks of the old building. Most of his neighbors were other students who kept to themselves. They'd nod politely in the hallways or share awkward small talk in the elevator, but that was about it. Everyone seemed too busy with their own lives to get involved with anyone else's drama. The girl who lived across the hall was different, though. Her name was Lily, and she was studying something artsy. He thought maybe art therapy or psychology, based on the textbooks he'd seen her carrying. She had this way of moving through the world that seemed effortless, like she belonged wherever she happened to be. Her dark hair always seemed to catch the light just right, and she wore these flowing dresses that made her look like she'd stepped out of a different time period. Jake had noticed her, of course. It would have been impossible not to, but their worlds never really crossed paths beyond those polite hallway encounters. She seemed confident and social, always having friends over or heading out to events. He was the quiet bookworm who preferred staying in with a good novel. They were like two ships passing in the night, sharing the same building but living completely different lives. Jake told himself he was fine with that arrangement. He wasn't looking for complications or drama. His studies were demanding enough, and adding social relationships to the mix just seemed like asking for trouble. Besides, someone like Lily probably wouldn't be interested in a guy who spent his Friday nights reading poetry and drinking tea. But sometimes, late at night when he heard her laughing with friends in the hallway or playing music in her apartment, Jake would wonder what it would be like to be part of that world. He'd imagine what they might talk about if they ever had a real conversation. Would she think his passion for literature was boring? Would he understand her artistic way of looking at the world? These thoughts usually came and went quickly, pushed aside by whatever assignment or project demanded his attention. Jake was good at compartmentalizing his life, keeping everything neat and separate just like his apartment. The building itself had its own rhythm and personality. Mrs. Chen on the first floor always cooked something that made the whole place smell like garlic and spices. The guy upstairs played guitar at all hours, but he was actually pretty good, so nobody complained much. The couple next to Jake fought sometimes, but they also made up loudly, so it balanced out in a weird way. Jake had learned to tune out most of the building's daily soundtrack. He had his routines and his quiet spaces, and that was enough. He'd found a way to create peace in the middle of all the chaos that came with apartment living. On this particular Tuesday night in October, everything seemed normal. Jake had followed his usual evening routine. He'd made himself a simple dinner, spaghetti with store-bought sauce and a side salad. Nothing fancy, but it filled him up and left him enough energy to tackle his research. He'd spent 2 solid hours working on his thesis, diving deep into the symbolism in Latin American literature. The work was challenging but engaging, the kind of intellectual puzzle that made him forget about everything else. His professor had praised his analytical skills, saying he had a natural talent for uncovering the deeper meanings in complex texts. After finishing his studying, Jake had settled into bed with his worn copy of a novel he'd read at least 5 times before. The familiar words were comforting, like visiting an old friend. The rain had started around 10, a steady drumming against his window that created the perfect background noise for reading. He was just starting to feel drowsy, his eyelids getting heavy as he read the same paragraph twice without absorbing the words when the peace of his evening was shattered. It started with voices in the hallway, angry, raised voices that cut through the white noise of the rain. Jake tried to ignore it at first, pulling his pillow over his head and hoping whatever drama was unfolding would resolve itself quickly. College students fought about everything: relationships, money, grades, whose turn it was to take out the trash. But the voices got louder, and then he heard a door slam so hard it made his own door rattle in its frame. Then came the sound that made his chest tighten: someone crying. Not just sniffling or quiet tears, but the kind of sobbing that comes from deep hurt. Jake lay in bed, torn between his natural instinct to mind his own business and a growing sense that someone really needed help. The crying continued, raw and heartbreaking, echoing off the thin walls of the old building. He was reaching for his robe, his conscience finally winning the battle with his desire to stay uninvolved, when something happened that changed everything. His bedroom door, which he was absolutely certain he had locked, suddenly swung open, and there she was. Lily stood in his doorway like a ghost that had suddenly become real. The hallway light behind her created a soft outline around her figure, but Jake could see her face clearly enough to know something was terribly wrong. Her cheeks were wet, with tears that caught the dim light, and her whole body was shaking like a leaf in the wind. Jake's heart started pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it across the room. He sat up in bed, pulling his blanket up to his chest, completely confused about what was happening. His mind was racing with questions, but his mouth felt like it was full of cotton. "Lily?" he managed to whisper, his voice cracking slightly. "How did you get in here? My door was locked." She stepped into his room and quietly closed the door behind her. In her hand, she held up what looked like a student ID card, the plastic catching the light from his bedside lamp. Her usual confidence was nowhere to be found. Instead, she looked like someone who had been completely broken down by whatever had happened in the hallway. "Art students learn all kinds of useful tricks," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her properly. "Sorry for just barging in like this. I know this is crazy." Jake watched in complete shock as she reached down and started to lift her dress over her head. His first instinct was to look away, to give her privacy, but something about the way she was moving made him realize this wasn't what it might look like. She wasn't trying to be romantic or seductive. She was soaking wet from the rain, and her dress was clinging to her skin in a way that looked uncomfortable. "I'm completely soaked," she explained, as if reading his thoughts. "I was standing outside in the rain for I don't know how long, and this thing is dripping all over your floor." She was right. Small puddles were forming where she stood, and her hair was dripping water onto his wooden floor. Underneath the dress, she was wearing simple clothes, a tank top and regular underwear, nothing fancy or planned. She looked like someone who had been caught in a sudden storm and was just trying to get warm and dry. Jake's brain was still trying to catch up with what was happening. This was Lily, the girl from across the hall who he'd barely spoken to in almost a year of living in the same building. And now she was in his bedroom at nearly midnight, taking off wet clothes and looking like her world had just fallen apart. "Move over," she said, walking toward his bed. Those two simple words hit Jake like a lightning bolt. Move over. She wanted to get into his bed, with him. His mind immediately started spinning with all the reasons this was a terrible idea. They barely knew each other. She was upset and probably not thinking clearly. What if someone found out? What if she regretted it in the morning? What if he was completely misunderstanding the situation? But then he looked at her face again, really looked at it, and all his logical concerns melted away. She wasn't looking at him like he was a guy she was interested in. She was looking at him like he was a life preserver, and she was drowning in the middle of an ocean. Without really thinking about it, Jake scooted over to one side of his narrow bed. It wasn't a big bed, just a regular twin size that barely fit one person comfortably. But somehow, it seemed like the right thing to do. Lily climbed in beside him, immediately pulling his blanket up to her chin. The first thing Jake noticed was how cold she was. Her whole body was shivering, and when her arm accidentally brushed against his, it felt like ice. The second thing he noticed was how small she seemed. This girl who had always appeared so confident and put together in the hallways now looked fragile and lost. They lay there in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Jake could hear the rain still pattering against his window, mixing with the sound of both of their breathing. He wanted to ask her what had happened, wanted to know why she was in his room instead of her own, wanted to understand how his quiet Tuesday night had suddenly turned into something out of a movie. But something about the silence felt important, like it was giving Lily the space she needed to pull herself back together. Jake had always been better with silence than with words anyway. He knew how to sit with uncomfortable feelings without trying to fix them immediately. Gradually, he felt her body start to relax beside him. The violent shivering slowed down to just occasional trembles, and her breathing became deeper and more regular. The warmth from the blanket and from sharing the small space was helping her get warm again. Jake found himself hyper-aware of every little detail. The way her hair smelled like rain and something floral, probably her shampoo. The soft sound she made when she adjusted her position, the fact that she was lying on the side of the bed where he usually kept his extra pillow. This was definitely the weirdest night of his life. But it wasn't scary weird. It was more like the kind of weird that happens when the universe suddenly decides to shake things up and push you in a direction you never saw coming. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would let her know she was safe and that whatever had happened was going to be okay. But Jake had never been good with the right words in emotional situations. He was much better at analyzing other people's words in books than coming up with his own in real life. So instead, he just stayed still and quiet, letting his presence be whatever kind of comfort it could be. Sometimes, he thought, the best thing you can do for someone is just be there, without trying to fix anything or solve any problems. The rain kept falling outside, creating a peaceful backdrop to this completely unpeaceful situation. And slowly, very slowly, Jake felt some of the tension start to leave Lily's body as she began to feel safe enough to finally rest. The silence stretched on for so long that Jake started to wonder if Lily had fallen asleep. Her breathing had become steady and deep, and she'd stopped shivering completely. But just when he thought she might be drifting off, her voice cut through the darkness, so soft he almost missed it. "My boyfriend has been staying at my place for 3 weeks," she whispered into the quiet room. "Well, I guess he's my ex-boyfriend now." Jake didn't know what to say to that. He'd never been great at handling other people's relationship problems, mainly because he'd never had many relationships of his own to learn from. But something in the way her voice cracked told him this wasn't just a normal breakup story. "Tonight I came home from my evening class and found him in my bed with my roommate," she continued, her words coming out in a rush like she needed to get them out before she lost her nerve. "They didn't even hear me come in. I just stood there, in my own doorway, watching them, and I couldn't even move for like 5 whole minutes." Jake felt his stomach twist with anger on her behalf. He'd never met Lily's boyfriend, but he'd seen him around the building a few times. A tall guy with perfectly styled hair who always seemed to be talking loudly on his phone. He'd always struck Jake as the kind of person who thought the world revolved around him. "I'm so sorry," Jake said quietly. It felt like a completely useless thing to say, but it was the only thing he could think of that felt honest. "The worst part wasn't even catching them," Lily went on, and Jake could feel her tension building again as she relived the memory. "It was what happened after. When they finally noticed me standing there, neither of them looked sorry or embarrassed. They looked annoyed, like I was interrupting something and being unreasonable about it." Jake turned slightly toward her, though in the darkness he could barely make out her profile. "What did you do?" "I told them both to get out. Right then, immediately. I didn't yell or cry or throw things like they probably expected. I just said, 'Get your stuff and leave my apartment right now,' in this really calm voice that didn't even sound like me." There was something in the way she described her reaction that made Jake respect her even more. A lot of people would have screamed or thrown things or caused a huge scene. But Lily had kept her dignity even in the moment when her world was falling apart. "They actually left?" Jake asked. "Oh yeah, they left. But not before my roommate told me I was being dramatic and that it wasn't that big of a deal. She said they'd been attracted to each other for months and that I should be happy they finally acted on it instead of sneaking around behind my back." Jake felt his hands clench into fists under the blanket. "She said that to you? In your own apartment? She also said that maybe if I hadn't been so focused on school and work all the time, my boyfriend wouldn't have felt neglected, and none of this would have happened. Like it was my fault for trying to get good grades and pay my rent. The unfairness of it all made Jake's chest burn with anger. Here was this girl who was clearly working hard to build a good life for herself, and the people closest to her had not only betrayed her, but then tried to make her feel like it was her own fault. After they left, I just sat in my living room for hours. Lily continued, her voice getting smaller. Everything in that apartment reminded me of him or of times we'd all hung out together as friends. The couch where we used to watch movies. The kitchen table where we'd eat breakfast on Sunday mornings. Even the bathroom smelled like his stupid expensive cologne. Jake could picture it perfectly. That horrible feeling when a place that used to feel like home suddenly feels like a museum of bad memories. I tried to sleep in my own bed, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. So I ended up sitting by my window, watching it rain, trying to figure out where I could go. I don't have family in town, and most of my friends are also her friends, so that felt complicated. Why did you come here? Jake asked gently. It was the question that had been burning in his mind since she'd first appeared in his doorway. Lily was quiet for so long that Jake thought maybe he'd overstepped somehow. But then she spoke, and her words surprised him completely. Because you're the only person in this building who's never wanted anything from me, she said. Do you know how rare that is? Jake didn't understand what she meant, and his confusion must have shown somehow because she continued explaining. Every guy I've met since I moved here has either hit on me, asked me out, made weird comments about my clothes, or tried to find excuses to start conversations when I'm obviously busy. Even some of the girls act like I'm competition for something. But you've never done any of that. Jake felt heat creep up his neck. The truth was, he had noticed her and had thought about asking her out about 1,000,000 times. But his shyness had always won out over his curiosity. You just exist peacefully, Lily said, and there was something almost grateful in her voice. You nod when we pass in the hall, you hold the elevator door when you see me coming, and you've never once made me feel like I owe you conversation or attention or anything else. Tonight, when I couldn't figure out where to go, I realized you were the only person I knew who might let me just fall apart without expecting me to perform or explain myself or be grateful in some specific way. Jake had never thought of his social awkwardness as a gift before, but hearing Lily describe it that way made him see himself differently. Maybe being the quiet guy who minded his own business wasn't such a bad thing after all. Jake woke up to sunlight streaming through his bedroom window and the unmistakable smell of coffee brewing in his tiny kitchen. For a few seconds he was completely confused. He never made coffee first thing in the morning. He was more of a stumble to the bathroom first kind of person. His brain felt foggy and slow, like he was trying to remember a dream that kept slipping away. Then everything came rushing back. Lily, the rain, the tears, the way she'd fallen asleep beside him sometime in the early hours of the morning, her breathing finally peaceful after hours of quiet conversation. Jake sat up carefully, trying not to make noise, and looked around his room. Lily's dress was draped over his desk chair, almost completely dry now. His extra blanket was folded neatly at the foot of the bed, and he could hear movement in the kitchen along with the sound of something sizzling in a pan. He grabbed a clean t-shirt from his dresser and quietly made his way to the kitchen, running, his hand through his messy hair and trying to look at least somewhat presentable. What he found there made him stop in the doorway. Lily was standing at his small stove wearing one of his oversized college sweatshirts that came down almost to her knees. She'd pulled her hair back into a messy bun, and she was scrambling eggs in his one good frying pan while humming softly to herself. The morning light coming through his kitchen window made everything look warm and golden, and for a moment Jake felt like he was looking at a scene from someone else's life. Someone who was used to having beautiful girls make breakfast in their kitchen. Good morning, she said without turning around, somehow sensing his presence. I hope you don't mind me borrowing this sweatshirt and your kitchen. I wanted to make you breakfast as a thank you before I go deal with the mess across the hall. You don't have to thank me, Jake said, leaning against the doorframe and watching her work. She moved around his small kitchen like she belonged there, finding plates and cups without having to search through cabinets. Anyone would have done the same thing. Lily turned to look at him then, and there was something firm and serious in her expression. No, Jake, not anyone. Most people would have either turned me away because it was weird and complicated, or they would have tried to take advantage of the situation. You just gave me exactly what I needed without expecting anything. In return, she divided the eggs between 2 plates and added toast that she'd apparently made while he was sleeping. The simple meal looked better than anything Jake usually managed to put together for himself. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked as they sat down at his small table. In the daylight, he could see that her eyes were still a little red from crying, but she looked stronger somehow, more like herself. "Better," she said, taking a sip of coffee. "Clearer. Last night I felt like my whole world had ended, but this morning I'm realizing that maybe it's just changing into something different. Maybe something better." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Jake found himself stealing glances at Lily, trying to memorize this moment. She looked different in his sweatshirt and with her hair messy from sleep, but not different in a bad way. She looked real and natural and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with the carefully put-together appearance he was used to seeing. In the hallways, "I need to ask you something," Lily said suddenly, setting down her fork and looking directly at him. Jake felt his heart speed up. There was something serious in her tone that made him nervous. "Okay. My lease is up at the end of this month anyway," she said. "I was planning to renew it, but obviously that's not going to work out now. I can't live across the hall from those memories, and honestly, I can't afford the place on my own without a roommate." Jake nodded, not sure where this was going, but sensing it was important. "I was thinking about your apartment last night, about how peaceful it feels here. Like you've created this space that's completely your own, where you can just be yourself without any drama or complications." She paused, seeming to gather her courage for whatever she was going to say next. "Would you be interested in finding a 2-bedroom place together? As roommates, I mean." The question hit Jake like a bolt of lightning. Living with Lily? Seeing her every day, sharing meals and conversations and the ordinary moments that make up a life? It sounded amazing and terrifying at the same time. His first instinct was to say no immediately. He liked his solitude, his predictable routines, his quiet life where he never had to worry about anyone else's feelings or needs. Living with another person would change everything about how he operated in the world. But as he looked at Lily sitting across from him in his sweatshirt, her hair catching the morning light and her expression hopeful but prepared for rejection, Jake realized that maybe change wasn't always a bad thing. Maybe some changes were worth the risk. "Let me think about it," he heard himself saying, which surprised him because his brain was still frantically listing all the reasons it was a terrible idea. Lily smiled then. The first genuine, full smile he'd seen from her since she'd appeared in his doorway. It transformed her entire face and made Jake understand why people wrote poems about beautiful smiles. "Take all the time you need," she said. "But Jake, last night was the first time I've slept peacefully in months. I think we might actually make pretty good roommates." As she said it, Jake realized she was probably right. They'd managed to share a bed for one night without any awkwardness or complications. They'd talked for hours without running out of things to say. She'd made herself at home in his kitchen without making him feel invaded or overwhelmed. Maybe this crazy idea wasn't so crazy after all. 6 months later, Jake was standing in the living room of their new apartment, watching Lily arrange colorful throw pillows on their couch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. She was nervous about something, though she was trying to hide it behind her usual busy energy. The apartment they'd found together was everything neither of them had known they wanted. It had high ceilings that made everything feel open and airy, huge windows that let in streams of natural light, and enough space for both of them to have their own areas without feeling cramped. More importantly, it felt like a completely fresh start for both of them. Living with Lily had been nothing like Jake had expected. She was messier than he was, sure, and she had a habit of inviting friends over without much warning. But she was also incredibly thoughtful about his routines and his need for quiet time. She'd learned that he liked to read for an hour before bed, so she kept the TV volume low in the evenings. She'd noticed that he got overwhelmed when too many people were around, so she always gave him a heads up when she was planning to have company. In return, Jake had learned to be more flexible about his rigid schedules. He'd discovered that he actually enjoyed some of the chaos that Lily brought into his life. Her friends were interesting people, artists and writers and musicians who saw the world in ways that challenged his thinking. Through them, he'd started going to art shows and poetry readings, things he would never have considered before. "Are you going to tell me what's making you so fidgety today?" Jake asked, settling into his favorite reading chair with a cup of coffee. Lily stopped adjusting pillows and looked at him with that expression she got when she was trying to decide whether to say something important. "I have something I want to talk to you about." Jake felt his stomach flip. In his experience, conversations that started that way usually didn't end well. "Okay." Instead of sitting on the couch, Lily walked over to his chair and perched on the arm of it, close enough that he could smell her shampoo. It was the same floral scent he remembered from that first night, and it still made his heart beat a little faster. "Do you remember that night when I basically broke into your room and turned your whole life upside down?" she asked. Jake smiled. "I remember it being slightly less dramatic than that, but yes. I've been thinking about that night a lot lately," Lily continued. "About how desperate and lost I felt and how you just made space for me without asking for explanations or trying to fix everything." Jake waited, sensing that she was building up to something bigger. "The thing is, that night I thought I was running away from my old life. But somewhere along the way I realized I was actually running toward something. Toward this. Toward us. Toward the person I am when I'm around you." Jake's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. "Lily, let me finish," she said quickly. "I know we agreed to be roommates and friends, and I know that's worked out really well for both of us. But I also know that I've been falling in love with you for months, and I can't keep pretending that I haven't been." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that could either connect them or burn down completely. Jake set his coffee mug down carefully, his hands suddenly shaking. "I've been in love with you since about 2 weeks after we moved in here," he admitted quietly. "I just didn't want to mess up what we had by making it complicated." Lily laughed, and the sound was bright and full of relief. "Jake, we've been sharing a life for 6 months. We grocery shop together. We've painted these walls together. We know each other's weird habits and moods and favorite foods. It's already complicated. The question is whether we want it to be complicated together, or if we want to keep pretending it's simple." Jake looked at her, really looked at her, sitting on the arm of his chair in one of those flowing dresses she loved, her hair catching the afternoon light from their big windows. She was right. They'd been dancing around their feelings for months, building something that looked like a relationship while calling it friendship. "What if it doesn't work?" he asked. "What if we try this and it ruins everything we've built?" "What if it does work?" Lily countered. "What if we're actually perfect for each other and we've been too scared to find out?" Jake thought about all the small moments that had led them to this conversation. The way Lily always saved him the last cup of coffee in the morning. How she'd started leaving little notes in his books when she borrowed them, pointing out passages she thought he'd find interesting. The way they'd developed their own language of looks and gestures that let them communicate across crowded rooms. He thought about Sunday mornings when they sat on their fire escape with coffee and newspapers, not talking much but enjoying each other's company. About the way she'd held his hand during scary parts of movies and how natural it had felt. About the night she'd had food poisoning and he'd stayed up taking care of her, and how right it had felt to be the person she needed. "I want to try," he said finally. "I want to see what happens when we stop pretending this is just friendship." Lily's smile was like sunrise breaking over mountains. She slid from the arm of his chair directly into his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. "I was hoping you'd say that," she whispered against his ear. As Jake held her close, breathing in that familiar floral scent and feeling her heartbeat against his chest, he thought about how that crazy night 6 months ago had felt like an ending. The end of his quiet, predictable life. The end of his carefully controlled world. But it had actually been the beginning of something he never could have planned or predicted. The beginning of learning that the best things in life often come through unlocked doors in the middle of the night. Carried by people brave enough to ask for what they need and trust enough to let someone else help them find it.